You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, the complete guide to Star Trek The Next Generation. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This week we have been watching Suddenly Human. It first aired the week of October 15th, 1990. It was written by John Whelpley, Jerry Taylor and Ralph Phillips and directed by Gabriel Beaumont. James, what happens in this one?
The Enterprise answers a distress call and finds a training ship with 4 young Talarians on board, and 1 human. It turns out this young man has been raised as a Talarian after his Starfleet-serving parents were killed in battle. He shows signs of abuse and is reluctant to acknowledge his human heritage. The only person he will respond to is Picard, who teaches him about his past and tries to convince him that he should return to humanity. When the boy's Talarian father arrives, he threatens war if his son is not returned. But what is the right thing to do?
What is the right thing to do? Well, Alex, you'd never seen this episode before. What did you think of it?
It's not bad.
Is it basically fine?
It's probably better than basically fine. It's maybe fine. It's got an interesting premise. It's got an interesting discussion point. I'm not sure how I feel about the way that they resolve that discussion point, but yeah, it's a more interesting idea than a lot of episodes have had.
Yeah, I think it, to me, is just, it's such a Star Trek episode. It has an interesting idea, it's got a bit of a moral dilemma, it has an exploration of what it means to be human, and it's all very well executed. I don't think it is anything exceptional, but I think it is better than average. I don't think I enjoyed it especially. I think it's very Star Trek and I think it's very serious and there's a lot of interesting stuff there, but I don't think it's necessarily that much of a fun watch.
Yeah, I mean, there's episodes that I could see myself going back and watching, and there's episodes that I couldn't face rewatching. I could face watching this again if it was on. I just don't think I'd go out of my way to see it again. I feel, yes, it was a good story to cover, but we've covered it, and I don't think I'd really get anything more out of it than what I got on the initial viewing.
It feels all along the same lines of things that were done in Season 2 and 3 to me.
But done better.
There is that, but it feels like at this point they should be moving away from those style of stories. And you say it feels very Star Trek. It seems to me very Star Trek The Next Generation. It's generic Star Trek The Next Generation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it just doesn't feel adventurous in any great way. And I don't think it throws up moral dilemmas, but I don't think it really wants to tackle them. And
no, I mean it's kind of inconsequential as well, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot riding on such a small thing, such a small thing as child abduction. But at one point, when Worf says, "Was it worth going to war over one child?" Yeah, I'm kind of thinking that as well. Not from any philosophical point of view, but just. Well, I mean, if it weren't Star Trek, I would say he's a boy that probably spends most evenings on Reddit. I mean, he is a bit alt-righty, isn't he? He doesn't like women. He's got that hairstyle. It's Milo Yiannopoulos in space. Despite
the almost cliched Star Trek alien race, the sort of warriorish culture that demeans women. I don't know what that says about maybe the writers of Star Trek. I think it's actually a good performance. I think you do manage to sympathise with the character. I think it would be very easy to make him absolutely hateful, and I think it would be very easy to mishandle this issue completely in a way which leaves you not only unsatisfied but feeling a little bit dirty. I do think they address the issues. They do not necessarily get to the meat of it, but I certainly think thought has gone into all of the ramifications of what is stated in the episode.
I think it's nicely developed, that it keeps changing. That there's too many episodes of The Next Generation so far where something's set up and then we spend half an hour just running on the same spot to then get to the next development of the plot. And that's not really the case here. It has a logical progression. And as you say, I have no problem with the guest actor's performance. I think he delivers exactly what's required of him very well. I think maybe there's a slight issue that they... On the writing side, although they have thought about how to progress it and they've thought about the ramifications, as you say, they've maybe not fully nailed for me exactly how to present it, because half of the time it's dealing with someone from a completely different culture, and that's the interesting stuff, and then the other side of the time it's a moody adolescent teenager listening to his damn rock music.
Well, I suppose we should kind of go back to the beginning, because why not? Distress call, very standard Star Trek. They answer it. Could it be a trap? And that all seems quite interesting. That seems like they're setting up something completely different. They normally do this, and they booby trap their ships, and then everybody dies, and there's no way to tell. Well, head right over number one. On you go. But then it's not that story. It is a completely different story. It's the lost child story, and they go on board. And what do? He's injured. He's lying on the ground. Take off his helmet. Now, have they done a first aid course? Basic first aid course. Scene. Never take off the helmet. That's just the advice you're giving.
It's in the future. In the future, medicine has advanced to the point where we can take helmets off.
They're space helmets.
There's nothing quite the same to get you in a good mood at the start of the episode, is there, as mass child death and injury.
It's Alien 3 all over again.
Yeah, it really just lifts the tone and makes me go, yep, let's do this. Wait a minute, one of them's human, even better.
And I was thinking about this a little, because this is a classic Star Trek story, isn't it? I don't mean this particular episode's a classic Star Trek story, but you have that child of two worlds thing. And you've got almost the opposite of Worf. You've got a Klingon who was found at the scene of a battle by human parents, and they raised him. No question of them taking him to Klingon and putting him with his family. No. Be raised as a Klingon. And I think even in Star Trek Discovery, you've got that with Michael Burnham. You've got the human who is raised on Vulcan as well. So it seems to me that this is something that Star Trek quite likes exploring, because it gives them an angle on what it means to be human. Is it being raised human? Is it growing up around humans? Do you retain your humanity even if you're in a completely different culture? So in that sense, I think it is very Star Trek, and I almost thought you could have used Worf in this episode quite effectively, couldn't you?
Yeah, it is weird that they don't use him, really, isn't it? Because that is the logical character to revolve this around. I mean, you can still have all of the stuff with Picard, but the person that has Picard's ear should be Worf. And it's not. And that's a really odd thing to miss.
Yeah, but I do feel that the sort of elevator pitch for this, though, might have been Picard has to raise a moody teenage son. It's almost a sitcom-esque moment, and I think you get that in the conversations with Troy. It's like, well, it's down to you, and you can almost hear that sort of burr, burr, burr playing, and it's sort of it's a different tone to the rest of the episode. I think these exchanges with Troy, where Picard's going, I'm not going to talk to him, I'm not going to help him, I don't want to, I'm just going to play on my computer. And then Troy's going, well, Captain, he looks to you as a father figure. And it's slightly off, because I think there are some very serious and there's some very difficult issues going on, but then you've got this wise captain saying, well, I don't want to help him, and you think, well, I know Picard doesn't like children, and that's a very established thing, and they delve into that a bit, but it does just seem like he's being completely unreasonable and petulant.
Maybe I'm reading into it too much, but it seems to me that the tonal shifts are kind of intentional. It's kind of the moody nature of a teenager, so you've got these shifts within the episode where it can go from serious to silly. 1 second you've got a banana split in Wesley Crusher's face, and the next you have Picard's getting stabbed.
It almost makes you wonder if the original version of the episode, well, if such a thing existed, if it was more in one direction or the other, if it was really serious to start, or if it was just, very comedic, just you take out all of the scenes of angst and it's just a lot of Picard going, Jono, you've been in that shower a very long time. And my ready room, I've got to say, it smells of weed.
And I think there is something of that in the episodes, and there's probably something interesting in that, and it's maybe to the credit that the episode does work and it doesn't feel like it's a complete tonal mess, but I think that it does manage to gel together, but there are definitely hints of different ideas that could have come into play in a different draft or a slightly different variation of this episode, and in the end I think you get something which is serious and does raise issues, but I'm not sure it really ever explores them to the full. But I think it does a satisfying job.
Yeah, but by the end, they've weighed up the two sides of the argument. It's just that it's again that thing of, if you had Worf come in, Worf could present that side of the argument rather than Picard going, well, this is a pickle, we could do this. But then there'd be this problem. Well, I suppose it's difficult either way. And I mean, yeah, it covers the bases, but I kind of expected a bit more analysis of it.
I think the big issue is
child abduction.
Well, there's the child abduction aspect of it, and you can sort of go, yeah, you can see why. In the heat of battle, they find a child and it is raised as their own. I think that's kind of it's a classic kind of literary device. That's fine. But it's when he is examined by Dr. Crusher, when he's taken back to the ship, and they find all these severe injuries. They've got broken ribs and broken arms, and he seems to have post-traumatic stress, you might say it in some ways. He refuses to let anyone touch him, and he screams, and you have all of this here, and which does very much point to abuse, and that I don't think they ever really explore that particularly much. It's almost hand-waved away later when Picard goes, boys will be boys, I've spoken to his father.
What's a broken pelvis and a few ribs between good fun among some boys?
But by the same account, you can say people get injuries through their life. That happens. That's a fact of life. And I guess in a very sort of a world where the physicality is kind of the priority, you'd say people are maybe more vulnerable to injuries.
He would have to be very clumsy to pick up all of those injuries. It's just like the clumsy waiter off The Simpsons who keeps falling over and falling out the window.
So I think that aspect of it is maybe a bit underwritten. I think that maybe did need either not to be there at all or to be slightly more explored, because I think we go from that trauma to the trauma of seeing your parents murdered and having those repressed memories come back. And I think at the end of the episode, Picard almost says, well, we should have left them repressed and that would have been much better for everyone. And you kind of think...
I mean, one kudos to the episode, because it's not that far into it before you get that thing of Picard presenting him with the photos of his family. Now, in a lesser episode, you could see exactly the way it would go, which is that he starts to have the memories coming back exactly as he does here. It all plays out, and then he remembers, wait a minute, the man who I'm thinking is my father has done something terrible, and I remember it now, and so, yes, Captain, I'm coming back with you. And it would be a very clear-cut and easy decision. And they don't choose to do that here, and it's for the better.
I mean, it seems to me like this kid is probably suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. And do they even acknowledge that as a possibility?
Yes, Dr. Crusher says the word Stockholm Syndrome.
It pretty much is Stockholm Syndrome, surely. He's been beaten by his parents, you would assume. His adopted parents. That's why he's got all these bad injuries, and he wants to return to them because he has Stockholm Syndrome. Maybe I'm reading the episode too clear-cut from that point.
I think that is sort of the point of the episode. And people often make the argument that Star Trek is a bit clean-cut, that, they set up a moral dilemma and there's a right or a wrong answer. But I think there's a nice amount of ambiguity here. I don't think anybody's particularly in the right or the wrong. And in some ways, you can even say this is an exploration of what it means to have children and be in Starfleet, because this doesn't go well, as far as we can tell. They've done a little bit of exploration of what it means to lose a parent while you're a child on board a starship, and it means that an alien will serve as your pseudo-parent. But I guess it says this is a very dangerous thing to do, despite what they say, and there are going to be horrible consequences to it, or potentially horrible consequences to it. Is that the dark side of the Federation, that not necessarily everything does work out? There are bad things out there.
Well, and certainly throughout the episode, the Federation isn't necessarily always portrayed as, the good saving force, because it is stated by Endar that they were repelling the Federation invaders. Now, you could take that as hyperbole or whatever, and it really is throwaway. It's not really examined that much, but it sets up that interesting idea of, so what was the story there? They just say settlers, don't they? Yeah, which has some questionable connotations.
It's very rare at this point in Star Trek that the Federation is really questioned in this way, actually. It's not really until Deep Space Nine with the Maquis that people really start to question the actions of the Federation and start to openly talk about them as if they're not this perfect organisation, this perfect image of the future, which is probably because Gene Roddenberry had died by that point. But
hooray!
You wonder if Gene Roddenberry had actually read and understood this episode, if he may have been dead set against it.
I think the thing is, with this alien race, the Talarians, which sounds like a made-up Star Trek alien name, it's just like the most cliched kind of combination of syllables you could get, maybe. It's so hard to set up a new culture every time. And if it was Discovery, because Discovery's like, what have we got in the box? What do people know about? Like, it would be the Klingons, because people have heard of them, or the Romulans maybe. But to every week or every other week set up an all new alien race and their culture, and the culture is so important to this, and you've got these 4 others on board, and you never find out anything about them. You don't find out what they are doing or what their interest is or anything about the society other than it's male dominated and women aren't allowed to hold rank, and they mourn and they scream in a slightly Klingon-y way, and they're conquerors and they like war and they fight well, and I think it would have been so important to establish this culture a bit more so we could understand more about it, so we could actually identify more with their different values. It seems to me we very much really only get the human side, and potentially there has been trauma. And I think that's a balance the episode could have struck a little bit better, because you really don't get any perspective on it other than they're a bit warmongery.
Yeah, they're pretty generic, and it's another alien race where we value honor honour in our conflict. And you're going, A, it's familiar, and B, I question where this idea of noble savages is coming from.
Well, I think we should perhaps talk about the most important aspect of the episode. Racquetball.
Racquetball. Yes. I mean, wherever I saw this episode going, I wasn't expecting an extended squash sequence.
Do you know what I like to do to relax? Do we buy Picard as a racquetball, a squash player, really, in his nice jumpsuit?
They're very impractical for that game, aren't they? I mean, it gets quite intense quite quickly as well.
It does. I mean, that looked almost woolen. I don't imagine it would wick away the sweat.
No. It'd be like, carrying around a giant wet nappy.
I mean, I'm glad there's a different space to have a dramatic scene. They weren't just sitting in the quarters or in 10 forward or on the bridge. It was a different place to have a different sort of exchange for a child to experience his trauma.
Yeah, but you don't expect it to be a squash court. I mean, at that point, it's... Do you know what I like to do when we go? He's going to take him to the holodeck. They're going to go on a walk through some sort of scenic, computer-generated territory, and then
find a horse.
Yeah, exactly. They could get that horse back out. And instead, what we're greeted with is a game of squash, and then some slapstick with Wesley being sprayed in the face with some cream. And I'm just watching, thinking, what the hell is going on?
At least he didn't take him to a Dixon Hill novel.
I don't know. I can't work out why it would be squash. There's literally no reason other than somebody maybe said, we've got some spare holodeck tape lying around. We could kind of make a future squash court fairly easily. It's not like it's ever come up before or will again.
Did you keep mentioning Parisi's squares?
It's just one day Gene came to set and walks onto that holodeck set. Do you like it, Gene? You can play squash on it, I guess. He's a genius.
I like squash. I'm happy that they have squash or a variant of it in the future.
Squash, cordial, it's all good with me.
Now, do you know, talking of sets, one thing I did notice, Picard's quarters are better lit than any other set in Star Trek Next Generation, in that they're not very well lit. Lots of dark and shadows and things in there, and
it's weirdly, it's quite like the way they end up filming those sets in Star Trek V, isn't it? Because in that, obviously, they're having to low light it to try and make it not look like they're just using the Enterprise sets from the Next Generation because it's cheaper, because they are. And yeah, it's not dissimilar in a way to what they end up doing there.
I thought the thing always was they never had time to properly light them on TNG, or they'd just got a light setup that was quite restricted. But here it does seem they've actually taken the time to do some proper cinematography work, and I think it works. It does create a moody space to have these discussions and for an old man to get stabbed.
Captain's privilege, isn't it? I mean, they're walking around the Enterprise the rest of the time with its fairly sort of one-note lighting. I mean, apart from, say, when you're in engineering, because the massive giant tube of light obviously has to have some dark around it, because otherwise the cameras don't make it look very good. It must just be like, being eternally stuck on a flying Marriott hotel. And given the walls and everything else seem to be carpeted, yeah, it probably is.
I guess the big thing that happens at the end of the episode is Jono, is that his name? Jono seems to be becoming more human. He's laughing, he's eating ice cream, he's sort of making friends. And
he's stabbing a man in the heart.
Well, I guess that's the question. Is that just a script moment? Do you think that's authentic? The stabbing incident? Do you think that's a natural thing for the character to do, or is that we've got to get to the end of the episode and this seems like a fairly decent way to do it?
Gene, we've got 45 minutes and we haven't got a resolution for this episode. What do we have Jono do? He wants to stay, but we're not sure, Gene. It doesn't seem very dramatically satisfying. I don't know. Just who's that one I don't like? I don't know, Gene. The bald one. Patrick Stewart. Yeah, he stabs him or just kicks him in the face or something. He's a genius.
Because it's really unfortunate. This is the second time he's been stabbed now.
No, I was thinking that. He does have a severe lack of luck when it comes to that.
Well, I mean, he's got his artificial heart because he's just so eminently stabbable.
You would get a complex about it, wouldn't you, if you are stabbed multiple times?
By multiple different people.
It's very unfortunate. I do think it felt right within the episode that you would have this sudden outburst. You know, if you take a child out of this culture that he's grew up in and try to force another culture on him, he will lash out in this way. So I think they've earned it within the context of the last 10-15 minutes of the episode. I do think it's a tonal shift that works.
And then Picard's realization that, he stabbed me. And that just means I wasn't asking him how he was feeling, so he should go back. I don't have strong feelings either way. I don't know if it's the right or the wrong thing to do. I think it's a satisfying enough ending. I think even them bringing in his grandmother, which is something I don't think they would ever normally do, or they wouldn't have certainly done a year or two ago, is actually thinking about all the different permutations of the consequences of this. I'm not sure that often comes up, and I think, yeah, look, they've done that. He's got other family. He has something else. People want to see him.
Yeah, I know, but then at the same time, you think he's never met them. It's the equivalent of, say when one of your parents is talking about, you know Jean. I've no idea who that is. You know Jean. She's married to your cousin's sister. I've never met that cousin. They live in the United States. I've never met them. Well, yeah, you know Jean. Well, anyway, her husband died, and then this person, they're the child of their surrogate son. What? Well, and basically, they've just bought a new car. I couldn't give a shit. And you just, if you're presented with this, and Jono, this is your grandmother. I mean, you've never met her, and she doesn't particularly look that familiar to you, and she doesn't look that much like either of your parents, but she is your grandmother.
Do you know, I believe she was a Section 31 agent.
So Admiral Rosa is suspected to be a member of the rogue agency Section 31 in the Next Generation Section 31 novel Rogue.
Great.
Of course, that's not the only character from this episode that is expanded in Next Generation novels, because Jono reaches the rank equal to ensign in the Talarian space fleet. And he served as an apprentice to his adopted father, who was by then a Talarian ambassador to the United Federation of Planets, and accompanied him to a meeting with Captain Picard to discuss the Talarian Republic joining the Khitomer Accords, which I'm sure is an incredibly interesting story. That was an ebook, by the way, so I don't think that counts.
Okay. I'm sorry I missed out on that. It maybe has a bit of a neat ending in that they just decide to do a thing because they decide to do that thing. But you don't necessarily know it's the right or wrong thing to do. And I think that's maybe the strength, in that there are doubts either way on what the right thing to do is. And I think they dramatically explored all the permutations of the character. And, this isn't a show that has a B plot or anything. There's nothing going wrong with the warp core or Geordi isn't trying to adopt a space whale or anything like that. You know, it's very much a single character piece and exploring all the ramifications of him being taken out of one environment, being raised in another, and then being put back in this environment, and what that means. So, as a character piece, I think it is very well done, and they give it the right amount of attention and focus. And the ending, I don't know, and I think that's maybe a strength.
I think there's a lot of them sort of having to take people at their word. So, yeah, exactly that sort of thing of he's got a lot of broken bones. Well, boys will be boys. Well, fair enough. That's good enough for me. And that's kind of the end of that there. And they kind of have to just accept it. And yeah, you're right. Maybe the doubt that leaves in your mind is interesting, and that maybe you're still left with that thought of, well, maybe he would be better off not being there, but you can't dictate to someone, after you've presented both sides of the argument, you can't dictate to them what they must do when it's an individual with free will. Yeah, it's interesting. And as I said before, a worse episode following a similar template, and, you know, we kind of had them before, would just end with, oh, it turns out my father's a murderer. Well, I'm done with him, and that'd be the end of it. The ambiguity is nicer here.
Do you think, though, because I sort of do, we were meant to very much buy into Endar and his word. I think it's quite a nice performance. It's very limited in what he has. I think we sort of buy him, we sort of like him, or we're supposed to like him. I'm not really sure.
I didn't. I felt that there's two scenarios. One is that he's being mistreated by his parents, basically because he's human. Or the second is that society as a whole put Jono in danger just because, you know, much like the Klingons, they are much more physical. They fight a lot more. So he couldn't really survive as part of that race. And that's why he was in the state he was when they found him. You know, they were on a test ship with a bunch of kids, and they all could have easily been killed if the Enterprise wasn't there. We're meant to think, I think from our perspective, we're meant to see Jono as being in danger if he stays with those aliens, and it's just a matter of whether risking war with these aliens is worth one child's life, which I think by the end of the episode the answer is probably no, which is Worf's argument.
Well, he is quite annoying.
Well, particularly when he's doing his terror scream.
Yeah. Or just, you know, his hatred of women. He does that thing that the alt-right do a lot, which is referring to women as females.
Much like the Ferengi.
I think on that note, it's time for us to round up some various facts in Quickfire.
Quickfire.
So early on in the episode, Jono says, "Take me to Endar." And I thought, what? Where the Ewoks live? Sherman Howard, who played Captain Endar in this episode, would go on to appear as Sivar in Deep Space Nine episode Shakar, and to Greth in Voyager episode Prophecy. So he got to do all three of those TNG era shows.
The perennial favourite, The Nitpicker's Guide, states that Dr. Crusher's skills must be improving. In this episode, Jono stabs Picard with a knife, and in very short order, Picard seems to be fine. Crusher says that the blade glanced on the sternum, a bone in the centre of the chest. In Who Watches the Watchers, however, Picard is shot in the shoulder with an arrow, and even after Dr. Crusher fixes him up, Picard wears a sling to support his arm. Yeah, it's almost as if injuries in different places require different medicinal treatment.
Maybe just as Picard gets stabbed more, he just becomes more stab-proof.
Interestingly enough, there are some quotes from Michael Piller, which basically address exactly the things that we've said in the episode. So he says, we got some pretty angry letters on that show. They said, how can you let an abused child go back to the people who were abusing him? We really brought the child abuse issue up because it was the right and natural thing to do to bring it up in the context of the story. There are parallels to stories that go on in today's world about parents who fight over custody, and one says there's been abuse. Who'd you believe? But mostly it was a culture class story. It was a story of someone who was human, who had been raised in a totally alien environment. Is he human any longer? That's what the story really was about. And he also goes on to say, I was disappointed by the show primarily because the aliens weren't alien enough. I felt there was some miscommunication on some level. The whole idea that the show was missed because these savages, different alien type creatures, turned out to be very human.
So the previous episode to feature characters wailing in sickbay was Heart of Glory from Season 1, which is actually the first episode which mentions Talarians, because the Klingons from that episode are found on a Talarian freight ship.
Ooh.
Oh, it's all interconnected. It's like Marvel or some such shit.
It was all planned from the beginning. Really what happens was they originally were going to call the alien race Phrygians, but ended up, on the advice of Mike Okuda, changing that to Talarians because they'd been mentioned before.
Well, that about wraps up another episode. We will be back next time when we'll be talking about Remember Me. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Gene, what costumes do you want for these intergalactic misogynists? Leather chaps. He's a genius. What about the makeup, Gene? What about the facial feature? What can we do that's new? Some kind of ridged head. Haven't we done that before? What? With the Klingons, Gene. We've done it with the Klingons. I don't give a shit. Does it have tits in it? No, not this time, Gene. I don't care.